Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for our program sponsored by Massachusetts Peace Action, and particularly our group on No New Cold War with Russia and China is sponsoring this webinar tonight, where we're going to look at the recent US accusation of genocide in China and what that means for the future of US and China relations. The United States government for a long time has claimed to be a champion of human rights in the world. But of course, we know ongoing US violence and wars, interference in foreign countries, and brutal economic sanctions are reasons to give us doubt about this assertion. So on the very last day of the Trump presidency, the US State Department, led by Mike Pompeo, declared that the Chinese government is committing actively a genocide against the Uyghur, an ethnic minority native to the region of Xinjiang in northwestern China. Now, President Biden isn't known for agreeing with many of the policies of his predecessor, but on March 9th, his State Department spokesman, Ned Price, said that they have seen nothing that would change the assessment laid out by the Trump administration. So the United States has claimed that the Chinese government is systematically destroying the Uyghur people using concentration camps. And China pushes back and says that these camps are simply vocational schools. Now, obviously, both of these claims cannot be true. And we at Massachusetts Peace Action take neither claim at face value. So tonight, specifically, we're going to be talking about the momentous development of the United States, the world's largest economy and military, declaring that China, the world's second largest economy and military, is engaged in a genocide in Xinjiang province. We're going to look at what this means for the future of US-China relations and the danger of a new Cold War between the two countries. Now, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said in his confirmation hearing that China was the #1 threat to the United States among nation states. China is now second only to the United States, as I said, in military spending, and is seen as a rising power and potential challenger to American world hegemony. Concern about China is now being used as a driver for increased military spending, and officials from both the Democratic and Republican Party have called for full spectrum dominance over the entire Indo-Pacific region. Now, to be clear, the purpose of this discussion tonight is not to absolve China of any wrongdoing in Xinjiang province or to downplay the oppression of the Uyghur at the hands of the Chinese government. Massachusetts Peace Action supports the right of all people to live in peace and security, but we are deeply concerned that the United States is using the plight of the Uyghur to ramp up tensions, and that these tensions could lead to an arms race that would threaten the entire world. So we're going to look at whether the US government accusations of genocide and crimes against humanity are based on sincere concerns over the well-being of the Uyghur, or if they're cynical charges based on a desire to ratchet up those tensions between the two countries. And we're joined by two wonderful guests tonight, Max Blumenthal and Professor Zhun. Max Blumenthal is the editor-in-chief of The Gray Zone. He's an award-winning journalist and the author of several books, including Goliath, The 51-Day War, and the Management of Savagery. He has produced print articles for many publications, several documentaries, including Killing Gaza. In 2015, Max founded The Gray Zone to shine a journalistic light on America's state of perpetual war and its dangerous domestic repercussions. Professor Zhun is an associate professor of economics at John Jay College of the City University of New York. He's on leave from Howard University, and previously he has taught at Renmin University in Beijing. Zhu's main research interests include political economy of development, Chinese economy, and economic history. He is also on the editorial boards of Science and Society and the Journal of Labor and Society. So welcome to our two guests. Welcome, Max and June. I wanted to give the two of you a chance just to react to what I just said. And I will give the first word to you, Professor June.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for the invitation, the organizing by Massachusetts Peace Action. It's definitely, it's very timely, it's very important, and also understand all the possible pressures from different sides on such an event. I do not, in the past, I don't really do much research about the Xinjiang autonomous region. Well, it's not a province, it's the Xinjiang Uyghur autonomous region. But I got interested in such issues in recent years after the US mainstream media and the government started to portray the issues in Xinjiang as something that's utmost importance, as genocide even. And so I have been looking into this issue and have some of my own thoughts, which sometimes be critical of the Chinese policies, but I strongly disagree with the genocide assessment that we often hear from the mainstream media. So, we'll have some conversations tonight.
Thanks. I'll turn it over to Max. Do you have any reaction to the introduction that I just laid out?
Yeah, are we going to come back in with a larger presentation? Should I just kind of briefly react? I'm confused about the format here.
You can just briefly react, but feel free to go ahead and talk a little bit about the work that you have done on Xinjiang.
Well, I'll I want to keep equal time with June, so I'll just quickly react and then we can come back and I'll offer a larger survey of some of the work that we've done on the issue. I guess just to open, I want to say that we are speaking more or less on the anniversary of the criminal US invasion of Iraq, which was based on an information war waged against the US public to demobilize the peace movement and cultivate support for an assault that destroyed not just a country, but ravaged a region and left maybe 1 million civilians dead. We were told that Iraq possessed WMD. Our mainstream media went along with it. And before that, during the first attack on Iraq, or the first war with Iraq, to defend the wonderful democracy of Kuwait, we were told that Saddam Hussein's soldiers were going into infant wards in hospitals and taking children off of their incubators and killing them en masse. Those claims were advanced by a young girl who is very relatable, and you just wanted to hug her and wipe the tears off her face. Her name was Naira, and she had been coached by high-powered public relations firms, and her testimony was cultivated and basically written by the office of Tom Lantos on the Human Rights Committee of the Congressional Foreign Relations Committee, the Human Rights Caucus. And it was Tom Lantos and that Human Rights Caucus that later brought forth allegations about Tibet and Xinjiang, some of the first allegations. But Naira's testimony turned out to be completely false, as many of the testimonies that we hear today are. And it led to the catastrophe of Iraq. And we are also speaking very close to the anniversary of the NATO assault on Libya, which destroyed a previously stable, strong, prosperous African nation, which was a leader of the African Union, a counterweight to the US military operation known as AFRICOM, and which has led to a failed state, a migration crisis. And this war was sold the same way, with humanitarian interventionist deceptions, the US embracing a movement of opposition exiles, funding and arming Islamist proxy fighters, and bogus claims about Gaddafi's men being given Viagra to commit mass rape, conveyed uncritically through US media and demobilizing progressive peace groups. And I remember even myself being confused at the time. And we can talk about Syria as well and all of the interventionist deceptions that have been deployed. But I'm no longer confused. I'm no longer afraid to speak out. I see what the stakes are. And I think the framing of this event is backwards or upside down. We shouldn't be debating whether China is committing genocide or not. We should be discussing the obvious, open, overt, hybrid war that the United States is waging against China with the goal of the recolonization of Asia. And that's what I can discuss, but I do plan to get into some of the specific charges. That's what we've done at the Gray Zone, thegrayzone.com. You can see our work there. See, you can investigate our claims, but basically we have not been challenged on the facts. We simply get called genocide deniers. We get insulted, defenders of dictators, this kind of thing. But we think it's an important project to embark on, to start showing how these are not legitimate academic studies. They are part and parcel of an information war that is being waged to cultivate support in the US for another war that is much more dangerous than the war on Libya and the war on Iraq and the war on Syria. This is a war that poses an existential threat to civilization and which has already stained our society by morphing into a Cold War.
Thanks, Max. I would like to get your reaction, Zhun, as well. And how do you see the U.S. narrative of what's going on in China, and how do you see that affecting the relations between the two countries?
Thanks, Brian. First of all, I would like to mention that I admire the work that Max and his colleagues at Gray Zone have been doing. It's very important work. It's opens a window for the audience here in this country, in the West, to see what's really at stake, what's really going on. I have been, frankly speaking, very surprised sometimes to see the coverage, let's say New York Times, in some of the other mainstream news, how they talk about China. Things happening in China, and sometimes even I got confused myself. Say, am I a genocide denier? Because that's a very serious claim. But I think I've done the research. I've done some of the talks with my friends and colleagues in China who do this research, and I'm very convinced that the claim, the allegation of genocide is totally made up. It only serves certain propaganda purposes of the US government, which they want to do something out of that. But that's my reaction to what Max has just mentioned.
Thanks, Zhun. It sounded like, Max, that you wanted to get into a little bit more, and we will share the article that I believe you wrote with Gareth Porter, looking into some of these allegations and the sources for them. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you found and let our audience know? You're on mute, Max. Do you want to help unmute Max? Either Amar or Cole. Seems like he's having a little bit of trouble with his audio rather.
Try it now.
Yeah.
There you go.
You have to, it says that you have to unmute me.
Okay, sorry about that.
Okay, so thanks for the encouraging words, June, about the work we're doing. We've done several articles on this issue. I think we were one of the first publications in the US to start investigating who was behind all of these claims. And these claims came rapidly, suddenly, and they came in incendiary fashion. And that's when you know that an information war is underway. Whereas when we hear about the plight of the Palestinians, it's sort of a continuous story that is often actually suppressed because addressing their plight and their actual ethnic cleansing contravenes the interests of US power brokers and elites, people like Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who says that he inherited his belief in Israel's strength from his family. But here you have something that clearly is in the US interest. And then we started hearing about Xinjiang constantly, almost out of the blue, beginning in 2017, 2018. So just some quick background, and I would love for Zhun to address it too. If you've read my book, The Management of Savagery, or you haven't, I really would recommend it to provide you with background. Although this book is about the Middle East and Afghanistan, it is about the US's use of Salafi jihadi proxies to undermine its geopolitical foes, starting in 1979 in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen, which gave rise to Al-Qaeda, and many foreign fighters came from around the world to fight in Afghanistan. Some of them did come from Xinjiang, and they wanted to gain lessons. They were separatists. They wanted to wage a militarized guerrilla struggle against the Chinese government. And so they got training on the Afghan battlefield. They got training and spirit, and they also got Wahhabi ideology from figures like Omar Abdul Rahman, who was brought to the battlefield to instill this extremist fervor in fighters, and then was sent to New York on a special CIA visa after providing this service for the CIA in the United States. He was the blind sheikh who was later jailed in the so-called Monuments attack. But anyway, these several Uyghur fighters returned to Xinjiang. They brought this ideology with them, which comes from Saudi Arabia. They brought their training and their know-how. And China ultimately began to see mass casualty attacks in places like Urumqi and Kashgar, mass stabbings that would leave up to 30 people dead, car attacks in markets, bombings in markets. These were happening on a regular basis, starting in the mid-2000s. There were, of course, other proxy wars raging around the world, Bosnia, that many of these fighters participated in, and they formed a group called the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM, which has an affiliate today in Al-Qaeda-controlled Idlib in northwestern Syria called the Turkestan Islamic Party, or TIP. They're an open affiliate of Al-Qaeda. This group aimed to establish a Islamic state in the Xinjiang region and to separate from China. They found support from elements in Saudi Arabia, also Turkey, which is right next door and happens to be a member of NATO. And they provided a very similar service to NATO that the fighters like the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and Al-Qaeda affiliate in Libya that NATO used, or the Free Syrian Army in Syria, which became a weapons farm for Al-Qaeda and ISIS did. So very similar scenario. China wants to crack down. And this is where the surveillance comes in. This is where the repression comes in. And no one's denying that when there's a counterinsurgency that takes place, there is repression. Xi Jinping, the president of China, visits Xinjiang in, I think it was April or May 2014. And on the final day of his visit, there is a mass casualty attack in Urumqi, a major city, by the ETIM. Up to 40 people are killed, just innocent civilians, including Uyghur civilians. And he announces more militarization. He announces surveillance. You can go to, I'm sure people I know who've been to Xinjiang have seen cameras everywhere, metal detectors, that kind of thing, and massive investment, a poverty alleviation or eradication program, and massive investment, and a de-radicalization program, which includes what the Chinese government calls vocational centers. So that's the background for this. And it's unfortunate that the US media refuses to provide any of this context. It seems elementary. And it raises certain questions about what the United States would do in a similar situation if it had an armed separatist movement, possibly receiving foreign support, carrying out mass casualty attacks inside its territory. For example, to separate Texas from one of its states. What would the United States do? Well, this is the background. And so since the United States has decided under the Trump administration to turn up the heat on China, which it calls one of its great peer competitors, it is focused on the tension between a portion of the Uyghur population, which is separatist, and the Chinese government. And so since 2017 or 2018, we've been hearing about what are called concentration camps in order to evoke the Holocaust and liken China to Nazi Germany, forced labor, and mass sterilization, which is the charge that led to the claim of genocide by Mike Pompeo. These claims rely on three tactics, none of which involve on-the-ground journalism, and very few provide us with an actual picture of what's happening on the ground. We see a lot of document leaks, and it's very rare that we actually can see the primary documents, but the New York Times or International Consortium of Investigative Journalists will have, the China cables, and it will paint a picture of a surveillance state, not unlike maybe what we see on the US-Mexico border, and with the requisite embellishment by reporters who are vehemently anti-China. Then we have exile testimony. We get a lot of testimony that it recalls what I described earlier, the testimony of Naira. These are people who are coached, who are part of exile organizations, very similar to the North Korean defectors who are paid thousands, tens of thousands of dollars by South Korean intelligence to provide testimonies and indict North Korea. Many of them have recanted their testimony, been proven false. I actually did a video laying out all the falsehoods. If you go to thegrayzone.com, our National Endowment for Democracy piece lays that out. But these organizations are sponsored by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the US government's regime change arm. It was spun out of the CIA under Ronald Reagan. It exists to basically pay dissident movements, and it is the key sponsor of the World Uyghur Congress, which is the umbrella group responsible for all of the testimonies that we hear about what's going on in Xinjiang. It is an explicitly separatist organization with ties to the right-wing Turkish gray wolves. It has formed close, it began or really started making waves under the second Bush administration. It's then President Rabia Kadir, who was once one of the wealthiest women in China and is a Uyghur separatist leader. She formed close ties with George W. Bush. They became even closer to the US government under Donald Trump. And I don't know if any of you saw the video which circulated on Twitter the other day from an anti-racist rally in DC where people were out protesting anti-Asian racism. There were many Chinese people downtown in DC, Chinese Americans protesting, and a car caravan of Uyghur separatists drove by and began heckling them, chanting "Wipe out China." There were signs that said that the Communist Party of China had killed 80 million people. That car caravan was organized by the Uyghur American Association, which is an affiliate of the World Uyghur Congress, and is also sponsored by the US government, by the National Endowment for Democracy. It's very similar to the right-wing Cuban and Venezuelan exiles in Florida, which campaigned for regime change in their former countries. So that heckling of anti-racist activists was your tax dollars at work. Finally, the third tactic is the studies that we constantly hear about. A new study shows that China is has 1 million people in concentration camps, and the number fluctuates between 1 and 3 million, which would mean that anywhere from 1/12 to 1/4 of all of the entire Uyghur population in the Xinjiang Autonomous Province is in concentration camps, but somehow there are no images of that we can see. Those studies, 100% of them were conducted by Adrian Zentz or a US-backed exile organization called Chinese Human Rights Defenders. In the latter case, Chinese Human Rights Defenders, their study relied on interviews with 8 Uyghur people in the Xinjiang province. That's 8 people. And what they did was they extrapolated the population of their village out from their testimony to conjure up what they called an estimate of 1 million people. Adrian Zentz relied on a bogus study by a Uyghur separatist publication called Istiklal, which was reprinted in Newsweek Japan as his main citation for his estimate of anywhere from 150,000 to 1 million people. Then we see satellite photos. For some reason, they just can't get in there. So we see these satellite photos, which these studies are usually carried out by the Australian Strategic and Policy Institute, which is a right-wing think tank in Australia funded by the arms industry, the United States government, which through the State Department gave it $500,000 last year, the Australian Defense Ministry, and the British Foreign Office. I'm sure these are completely disinterested parties that have no interest in turning Australia into a Spartan-like bastion for waging war in the Pacific Rim and advancing the recolonization of East Asia. I'm sure they are not funding it. They're just funding it to do objective academic research. And the person conducting these studies, Nathan Ruser, who is a 20-year-old computer geek who has never been to China, well, I'm sure he's a great scholar, just like the person I mentioned before, Adrian Zentz. Adrian Zentz is responsible. If you just keep this name in mind, Z-E-N-Z, he's responsible for nearly everything you hear about Xinjiang. He is relied upon as the Xinjiang scholar who tells you that China is committing genocide. And Zentz happens to be someone who is a fundamentalist right-wing Christian who believes that socialism is satanic. He, before writing anything about Xinjiang, co-authored a book called Worthy to Escape: Why All Believers Will Not Be Raptured Before the Tribulation. This is very relevant because China is a socialist-oriented secular country that someone like Adrian Zentz sees as part of the Antichrist. And Adrian Zentz not only believes that socialism is satanic, he has argued in his book that hate crime and anti-discrimination laws will likely play a role in the suppression of biblical Christianity. I'm quoting from him. He is opposed to laws that forbid employers to discriminate based on gender or sexual orientations. That's a quote from his book. And he has attacked countries that ban the physical punishment of children. He's called for what he calls scriptural spanking. I can go on and on with his obscurantist right-wing views, but it's important to know that someone like that doesn't believe in birth control. They believe birth control is satanic. Contraception is satanic. Abortion is satanic. So that influences his view of everything that's taking place in China, where 1 billion condoms are distributed every year by the Chinese government, where there is a family planning policy that previously exempted Uyghurs and Tibetan and members of the Tibetan minority, and which applied only to Han Chinese, and which has resulted in a population decline across the board. So Zentz's, I mean, I guess I should speed up here, but Zentz's most consequential study accused China of forced sterilization. His study, I encourage everyone to read it because our media doesn't read it, and our media doesn't tell you that their main expert on this issue is a fundamentalist fanatic. That his study is so obviously, any educated person who's watching this right now should be able to go to his study and look at the footnotes and compare and try to find the coercion that he alleges, where he claims that 400, well, he claims that, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong document. He claims that 80% of all net added IUD placements in China were performed in Xinjiang, despite the fact that the region makes up only 2% of the nation's population. And he consistently links free healthcare and poverty eradication measures with coercion to take birth control. If you look at it, and then you look for his footnotes, and then you examine his footnotes as we did, he points to Chinese government statistics in the Chinese Statistical Yearbook, for example. And so we looked at it We had it translated. It's published by the National Health Commission. This is one of Zentz's major claims. And we found that the number of new IUD insertion procedures in Xinjiang in 2018 accounted for only 8.7% of China's total. So his major finding appeared to be off by a factor of 10, which is a staggering error that undermines the entire explosive quality of his argument. But again, the media isn't investigating. They're not looking for footnotes. They want to believe this. And so do his employers. Who employs this character? The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is Zentz's main employer in Washington. This is a right-wing, anti-communist think tank that cultivates exiles who want to denounce the governments of countries where the US seeks regime change. They're funded primarily by the right-wing Polish government and business interests. And this year, last year, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation defined all victims of COVID-19, 100% of all victims around the world of COVID-19 as victims of communism, because the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation blames China for COVID-19, just like Donald Trump did, encouraging anti-Asian racism across the country. That's Zentz's employer. Who publishes his papers? Is it an academic institution where there's peer review? Are there serious China scholars or people with differing perspectives like Zhun who can address the findings? No, it's the Jamestown Foundation, which is another right-wing neoconservative think tank set up in Washington under the watch of Reagan's CIA director, Bill Casey. So I have a way we can sort of settle this, because no one's able to prove genocide except through these bogus studies and dubious exile testimony, which I can go into as well, the specifics. Let's have an actual peer review of Adrian Zentz's work with scholars of all different persuasions who have real expertise on China, unlike him, who was previously a German tech developer and a theological teacher before all of this began. And let's really examine his work. And if it isn't true, then why don't we drop this allegation and start having diplomacy? Well, there's a good reason why this allegation wasn't dropped by the Biden administration. And that's because China is developing according to its own national interests. And as soon as China finds a Boris Yeltsin to lead it, who wants to do whatever the United States wants and allows his country to become balkanized and neoliberalized, then the US will happily drop that allegation. I mean, they're not making that allegation against allies like Saudi Arabia and Israel, so it's obvious they're not really honest about it. But what I wanted you to understand from this presentation is that these allegations, which are conveyed in increasing volume through mainstream and corporate media to make you think that they're organic, are emanating from a US government echo chamber by figures who are deeply ideologically and financially invested in the recolonization and humiliation of China and total American hegemony. And I mean, I could go on and on and on about this.
Yeah, I do want to give
June
a chance to get in here and specifically respond to some of the issues you raised. But one thing in particular that concerns me greatly is this level of anti-Asian violence that we're seeing in the United States. And I suspect that is tied to some of the really virulent anti-China rhetoric that we saw during the Trump administration. But also, we are seeing a continuation of some of those policies, unfortunately, from the Biden administration. So can you talk a little bit, Professor, about the effect of these policies on this increase in anti-Asian violence? Is that a concern for you as well? There you go. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Thank you. First of all, let me just say that I share many of the arguments that Max have already made. I think, yes, there is a direct connection this demonization of China in the mainstream media, and also the increasing hostile attitudes towards Chinese. And since many Americans couldn't really tell Chinese from other East Asian populations, so it's just anti-Asian sentiments, and also the increasing likelihood of physical attack against Asian people. So that I think that's definitely related. It's it becomes a virus, it becomes a crime, it becomes something that's corrupting, contaminating the American society, and to some people that would be already a sufficient cause to do some violent things. But let me just briefly mention what Max mentioned before. I think a lot of those reports, a lot of those allegations have been based on the testimonies of exiles from China. Well, you have exiles from other countries as well. And oftentimes, this is from my experience, the testimonies from the exiles tend to exaggerate things quite a bit. And they often tend to provide misleading testimonies as well. And given who is funding those exiles, they can, also provide the kind of stories that the funders like to hear, like to produce. So that's, I think it's very oftentimes very untrustworthy. One of the examples, not directly related to the Xinjiang stories, but the cult group Falun Gong, when they came to the United States from China, they were protected, they were supported financially, politically by the U.S. government, and look what they have become right now. The publication they had, the Epoch Times, already became a semi-mainstream news media, and they have played a major role in producing these conspiracy theories regarding the U.S. politics. So those exile groups, they can have a significant impact on the U.S. domestic politics. They can also have, I think, a notorious impact on the U.S. foreign policies as well. At the same time, I think, it is okay to compare some of the Chinese policies to the U.S. policies, which even the Chinese officials oftentimes do. They say, yeah, isn't this what we do here? Is also what the U.S. government is doing. But I always find that unsatisfying because, to be honest, the United States government have been doing so many bad things in history, and right now it doesn't. Even if we have the claim that China is as good, or let's say as bad as the United States, that doesn't really reassures anyone. I would say I think we need to do a lot of research on what is really going on in Xinjiang, what is happening to all the people there. But we shouldn't be misguided by the war propaganda from the governments, from the US governments, from the European Union. I will be very brief, but I'll mention some of the social context of the Xinjiang issues. The Xinjiang autonomous region, when the Chinese Revolution succeeded, like the Soviet Union, it embodies the principle of national self-determination. So every nationality, Uyghur is one of them, would have the right to have their own autonomous region, where you preserve your own culture. You go to the education system, mainly studying your own ethnic language. And until very recently, I think, according to the report I've read, for the Uyghur children, if they go to a standard Uyghur public school, learning the standard dialect, of the Mandarin language, is more like an elective. They learn it from 3rd grade. It's like learning Spanish in New York City. It's a sideline. And the preservation of culture among the Uyghur population is I think that job was very well done. In the long history since 1949, the ethnic relationship between the Han people and the Uyghur people, Kazakhs, and many others, they were harmonious. There is no severe, let's say, conflict or social unrest of any kind. To be sure, starting from 80s, 90s, you can see there's as Max mentioned, there's foreign extremist groups that have been sponsoring people to go to Xinjiang to do all kinds of things. But we know that most people in any society, they would not be attracted by such extremist ideology or tactics. But Xinjiang was I think it was struck in the 1990s by the neoliberal structural adjustment programs at the time, and which led to some severe economic and social problems. And to this day, I would like to say that Xinjiang has not really recovered from the neoliberal restructuring. Many of former public-owned enterprises, they were privatized and they went bankrupt. They became assets of a small group of people. And when that happened, workers, most cases, they would lose their jobs, and the minority workers, they were disproportionately hurt by that neoliberal transition. And when you do privatization, when you do marketization, when you do all sorts of those things that we have seen in many other parts of the world, including the United States, the theorists, some politicians, they will claim that don't worry, once we have the free market, it will bring back prosperity. It will create jobs. It will do all the things, good things you can imagine. But Xinjiang has never recovered. The private economy was not developing so well, and the public-owned sector has been devastated, and that has created some so-called major surplus population problem in the region. In some of the places where the Uyghur population is, I think it's more than 80-90% of the entire population, the claimed so-called unemployed or semi-employed people is about 40% or 50% of the local workforce, and that is a very high number, as you can imagine. And in that context, I think there is increasing social tensions, conflicts, and which was also taken advantage by the U.S. operations or Al-Qaeda operations, and the government, the Chinese government, I think responded by trying to let's say doing poverty alleviation programs. But since they didn't quite succeed in restoring the local industries, the local economy, many of them went bankrupt during the neoliberal reform. The only viable way, I think, for them to do was to say, how about this? We'll help you find an outside employment opportunity somewhere else where the economy is more developed and there is more job opportunities for you. And that is the basis of the so-called labor transfer programs. In many cases, the labor transfer programs were negotiated by the government So a local government in Xinjiang would negotiate a job contract with another government in relatively more advanced, developed province or district in another part of China. This contract would provide all the details. In the report that I've seen, when they mobilize young people to work in a distant place, they would have the local cadres working with them. They have chefs sent from Xinjiang to prepare food for them when they work in a distant location. The wages are reasonable. They're not super high, but they're not like minimum wage jobs. So I think it is based on that understanding that you start to see this transfer programs, which Zens and many other people claim is forced labor, because surely you don't want to go outside to work, find a job. You just want to stay at home. So once they move out of home, it must be forced labor. I think I find that very, I don't believe that at all. According to the report I've read, the local cadres, when they mobilize people, there were incidences of coercion. So there are people who really just don't want to move. They don't want to go outside, go to a different city to find jobs. And according to the report, the ratio is about 2%. 2% in that particular location that the workers didn't want to go, but they were somehow forced to go by the families, by the local cadres, etc. But there is no sign that there is particularly, from one ethnicity, let's say from the Han people, against the Uyghur people in that fashion. And needless to say, with such job transfer programs, that also the government started to do this vocational training, because when you move outside, and because of the neoliberal reform, there is very little, there is relatively less job opportunities in the Uyghur businesses. Many of them, when you go to work in the distant provinces, is owned by a Chinese employer. Your fellow workers are mostly Han people. And that means you have to learn new job skills. You have to learn the common dialect, for example. You needed to learn the language. And that, I think, provided the necessity for such vocational training. Again, that it started very early. It started in the early 2000s, right after the neoliberal reform. But I think it has been going on for 10 years until the scholars, some people in the United States calling that concentration camps, although it has been going on for quite a long time. It's an integral part of this effort of poverty alleviation within the market economy framework. It's not the perfect framework that I like to see. For me, the ideal way is to revitalize local economy, to revitalize the local industries, to revert the very, I think, very hurtful neoliberal policies. But without that, I think the government is trying to move people out into other places to get income. I wouldn't say that's forced labor or genocide, but I don't think that's ideal either. So that's my take on this.
Thanks, Zhun. And that actually leads me to a question that has been brought up in the chat by multiple people, including Lily and Steve, who are asking about independent verification for what's going on in Xinjiang. I think Max laid it out well, and many of us on the call know that the U.S. credibility on issues of human rights is not good. We have often sided with human rights abusers. We're doing it right now in Yemen with our support for Saudi Arabia. That's just only one example. But I would like to ask you both: what about independent investigators, journalists, institutions like the Red Cross, for instance, or maybe some that may be even better, that could go in and try and solve this issue? Because when you have one government saying that they're concentration camps and another saying that they're vocational schools, they both can't be true. It has to be somewhere in the middle. What about independent organizations going in and bringing back information?
Well, I just want to extend my invitation to the Chinese government right now to investigate our concentration camps on the US-Mexico border, where there are hundreds and hundreds of migrant children being held. I also would like to invite the Russian and Cuban governments to investigate our racialized system of mass incarceration, which our president helped establish through the crime bill that he campaigned on and was so proud of.
Max, I wouldn't be against that either.
And I also want to extend a hearty invitation to the Venezuelan government to see how the U.S. Capitol is being repaired after the January 6th riot, which was very similar to the riot carried out by the so-called pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong, who ransacked Hong Kong's parliament and vandalized it actually in much worse fashion than the Oath Keepers and company. But I want them to see it because the new furniture that will be brought into the Capitol will be produced with de facto slave labor. It will be produced by a company called Unicor, which relies on prison labor. And the US government is contractually obligated before it puts out bids to rely on prison labor for many things, including a lot of the furniture that you see in the US Capitol. It's odd that this isn't a bigger story since this is our government and we are supposed to live in a democracy and have the power to change it, but we instead focus so much of our attention and time on China. I should just mention in response to the question, there have been Americans who have visited Xinjiang and gone all around. Jerry Gray, he bicycled all across the Xinjiang province and saw it for himself with his own eyes and went into cities like Kashgar. And he came back and told his story and said, I loved it. And many of the Uyghur people I met are actually prospering and worshiping freely. And, you know, I'm not making it into a paradise. I'm just telling you what he said. He presented an image of it that was completely at odds with the portrayal we get in our nonstop dystopian information war. And Jerry Gray became the subject of an attack by a publication called Coda Story, which also attacked us at the Gray Zone as genocide deniers, which we found was being semi-covertly sponsored by the US State Department through its Global Engagement Center, which is the propaganda wing of the State Department. So Jerry Gray, just an American, he went on a bicycle trip and said, it's like he's sharing his postcards, and now he's the target of a media smear campaign by the State Department. I was on a panel that was sponsored by Canadian peace activists from across Canada just a few days ago with Omar Latif, who is another person from the West, Canadian, who went to Xinjiang on his own, on a tourist visa. He wasn't with a delegation. There were no government minders. And he came away with a completely different perspective. And I would encourage everyone. I personally am determined to go and would really like to go. The pandemic stopped me because China implemented a 14-day quarantine, and 2 weeks in a hotel room didn't sound very appealing to me. But, you know, when that's over and when it's possible to do so, I really encourage Mass Peace Action to organize a delegation and go see. It's something you can see. That's where we'll get the independent verification. Until then, we need to be really skeptical about the claims of our government and the echo chamber that it has created.
Yeah, and I think I can speak for Mass Peace Action when I say that we are skeptical of statements that come out of our State Department and the U.S. government, and we support citizen diplomacy as well. So I do think that that's a good suggestion. Zhun, would you like to address the question about independent folks doing some reporting about what's going on to get us real answers that don't come from either the Chinese government or the US government?
Yes, I think that would be very important, necessary to do. Right now, I think it's, for anyone to get into to China because of the COVID situation. But I think it's very likely that after the COVID restrictions is lifted, people can just visit Xinjiang. I don't think you need to have you need to file special papers to get there. I don't know there is any restriction regarding journalists, but let's say you're just tourists, you want to go around and take a look at everything, stay in a local family. I've never heard of any restriction regarding that. And in fact, I think the more we do that from the outside, the better picture we will get regarding what's going on in Xinjiang. I forgot to mention this, but I think, Brian, you previously mentioned sanctions. As I said, the Xinjiang, many, especially the Uyghur population, are largely agrarian. They work in agriculture. They produce tomatoes, cottons, and many things. And with the coming U.S. sanctions and also, many other sanctions, I think they would seriously hurt the small producers, the farmers in Xinjiang. And if they cannot get enough income from their main business, they will have to move away to do work in other places, which would, again, contribute to the so-called forced labor transfer that the U.S. government are accusing China of doing. But they are doing that, actually. It's the sanctions, it doesn't help anyone in Xinjiang. It should be lifted as soon as possible.
Thanks. We have a lot of great questions in the chat, but I wanted to next hand it over to Ryan Costello, who has his hand up. So I will allow you to unmute and go ahead and ask your question, Ryan.
Oh, thank you, Brian, and thank you both very much for this great presentation breaking down so many important aspects of the situation. My question's primarily for Zhun. You spoke, I've read your book, and you spoke about a very important process of the breakup of the privatization of the state-owned enterprises during the neoliberal policies that were carried out in China, how this affected the Uyghurs. But you just mentioned that the Uyghurs are a largely agrarian population. My own ignorance, I don't know to the degree of collectivization that existed in the agriculture pre-76 in Xinjiang. I was wondering if you could speak about the impact of that on the Uyghur population, how things have happened and developed since then. In particular, I was hoping you could also speak a little bit more just about the departure from the earlier, in my view, pre-76 were real revolutionary policies supporting the national minorities, and how those have transformed post-76 and especially recently. Just one more side note, just because for those who don't know, according to the Chinese government's own statistics, the incarceration rate in Xinjiang is higher than the incarceration rate in the United States. Which does not to excuse the horrible stuff the US is doing with mass incarceration, but it helps to put some of the stuff in context. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Ryan. I don't know very specific, I can't remember specific numbers regarding Xinjiang agriculture at this moment. But I think, as I mentioned, the People's Republic of China was built on the principle of socialism, self-determination. That's why we had the autonomous regions. And for a long time in the official documents, we call different, nowadays, ethnicity as nationalities. So you are part of the Uyghur nation nationality instead of one nationality, which is, as you can see, very different from the United States, where everyone is considered to be American, different ethnicities under American. And so I think it's a better model for different ethnicities, different groups, different nationalities to live together. But that was based on certain political, economic basis. There is a certain amount of economic planning. There is a very generous welfare package offered to the working class. There's a lot of state-owned enterprises, collective enterprises. So it was built based on that. Once the economic basis of all those were going away, it's still ongoing in Xinjiang. I think some of the former, the ethnic relation, this relationship would also get affected. As I mentioned, the neoliberal reform has brought a lot of damage to the Xinjiang economy. The Xinjiang agriculture itself was doing okay. There is part of the reason was that it has very high productivity of agricultural production, produces the very best cotton, among others. But there is a large population that increasingly, I think they need to find non-agricultural income sources. The statistics that just mentioned in this area of Hetian, where 80–90% of population is Uyghur, there is 60,000 people were considered to be surplus population, which means they had neither a job, urban job, nor they had any piece of land. So that's 40% of the workforce. I think it's a serious issue to the local society. And we're still feeling that impact today.
Thanks. Next, I want to get Conjeta in. I know that she has a question particularly about a recent development locally here in Massachusetts that is related to this issue. So go ahead, Conjeta. Just unmute yourself and you should be able to ask your question. There you go.
Okay. Thank you both so much for being here with us. And as Brian said, I wanted to bring this home to Massachusetts. I just have to explain a little bit before I ask my question. The rhetoric of genocide in China and its human rights violations are being fomented by U.S. Representative Seth Moulton in our state of Massachusetts, as he, along with other forces, has pressured Tufts University to close its Confucius Institute, a program using professors from China to teach the Mandarin language and culture of China. Groups like the Tibetan Association of Boston, Students for a Free Tibet, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese, have all protested the Confucius Institute because of the repression and genocide they say exists in China. And this rhetoric comes at a time when Asian Americans have been targeted and massacred in the United States out of hate and ignorance. So the US, led by Seth Moulton, the Pentagon, the right American politicians like Rubio and Cruz, and undoubtedly the CIA, which I've learned by reading Max's stuff, you always got to be on the lookout for them, is promoting racism, which has rightfully been designated as a public health crisis. This cultural program funded by the government of China is being distorted by perpetuating fear that the Chinese Communist Party poses a threat to colleges and our country. The opposite is true. The US poses the threat to colleges and country. What can we do?
I would give Zhun the floor here, but just quickly, it's interesting that the allegation about genocide is being weaponized to do away with the Confucius Institutes, which have been a target since well before and were explicitly targeted by Mike Pompeo. And then there was this media blitz about them being used to penetrate US universities, casting all Chinese students and those who were participants in Confucius Institute programs, which are aimed at cooperation and really promoting diplomacy, casting them all as Chinese agents. It's a way of holding Chinese nationals collectively responsible for policies their government is accused of enacting. And Seth Moulton is one of those militaristic Democrats who also was extremely active in promoting the Russiagate narrative, which was really, as the late Stephen F. Cohen called it, it was intelligence gate, and it was aimed at criminalizing diplomacy with Russia. So these are, I see these, I'm not saying they're acts of war on China. I just see them as acts of war in that it's part of a wider war, a hybrid war that may not, we have to hope, will not rise to the level of conventional war, but it's taking place in our communities right before our eyes. And the key actors in it are militarists and weaponized right-wing exiles whose communities have been cultivated and warped by the U.S. intelligence services over decades. So it's a real tragedy to see this happening, and I think we should brace ourselves for more of the kinds of racist acts that we've seen in recent days.
Yeah, I agree with Max. It's really sad to see that different institutions have closed as Confucius institutes. I don't know if the people who hate this institute so much have ever been to those places. It's I would say it requires some certain amount of imagination to connect them to, a spy institution. And Max mentioned the claim that all Chinese students or scholars are potential spies for the Chinese state. Obviously, that reinforces the idea of the stereotype, the racist attitude that the Chinese people are the same. We all somehow are controlled by the Chinese state government, and we would, I guess, do harmful things to the United States any time possible. And I think definitely they all contribute to the anti-Chinese Asian violence that we're seeing, because you are the enemy, and every one of you. You don't have to need to tell, because all of you are potential spies, agents, all the bad people. So it is unfortunate that we have got to this stage. As Max said, I surely do not hope this would rise to a conventional war. But even if we stay at the current level, it's already sufficiently toxic. It's so harmful to many people, not just the Asian population here, but anyone that wants to live in a society that still makes sense. So that's unfortunate, I think.
Thanks. I do want to do a time check. We're at almost 8:15, so I just want to check on you both, Zhun and Max. We got plenty of questions here. We'll probably not get to all of them, but I did just want to do a quick time check with the both of you.
I can do another 15 minutes or so.
Okay, fantastic. Next up, I see with his hand raised, John Ratliff. I will ask you to unmute yourself, and then you can go ahead and ask your question, John. There you go.
Okay, thank you, Brian, and I want to thank both of our guests for a really educational presentation. As you might tell from the color of my little goatee here, I've had some experience with U.S. foreign policy for a long time, and began my activism in the peace movement during the first Cold War. And I remember very, very similar allegations about genocide against Ukrainians and a whole movement that was shall we say, developed by you with the assistance of the U.S. intelligence apparatus in this country against, supporting Ukrainian exiles, often of a very hard right stripe, to attack the Soviet Union for its attempted genocide against Ukraine. And this was even during the time when the premier of the Soviet Union and the head of the Russian or the Soviet Communist Party was a Ukrainian leader who transferred part of what had historically been Russian territory to the Ukraine. So I really don't see any difference. I think it's so important that the peace movement in this country take a strong position against those who formulate the justifications for imperial policies. And we should have learned that in the first Cold War. Most of the peace movement understood it then. I remember when the Mujahideen were being developed against Afghanistan, similar efforts were made against the Soviet Central Asian republics among the Uzbek and the other people there, where the Soviet Union had to face terrorist attacks in its own territory because of CIA support for them. So I just wanted to ask both of you if you think that this comparison to the history of the US, which, by the way, is at its core and in its DNA a nation based on genocide that developed its wealth and based on a continuing policy against the African American community, which has been brought to the UN as a policy of genocide. I think that's where the US peace movement should target its energies and not removing splinters in the eyes of others. Sorry.
Well, I agree with the sentiment. And I think the US peace movement is, it's at a low ebb for a lot of reasons. But it's a part of the anti-racist movement. It's a part of the migrant rights movement. It's a part of so many progressive movements. And it's also able to find cross-partisan alliances of mutual agreement with even people who are libertarian, who don't want to see the U.S. spending $800 billion a year on a bloated war budget that mostly goes back to Beltway bandit contractors. But it's important for people who really identify with the peace movement to be educators, to follow these issues closely, as most Americans don't. And our mainstream media does not want us to, and our foreign policy establishment, which is bipartisan, wants to keep this as undemocratic an issue as possible. It's really our job to democratize foreign policy, because the American public, it requires so much coercion more than ever before to support any of these warlike policies. And that it benefits not at all from the new Cold War with China. The Pentagon benefits enormously. Many people who live across the river from me, I live in Ward 8 in DC. It's a mostly poor and working class, mostly African-American ward in the city. Across the river, you see the names of the big contractors. You see these new gentrifier lofts going up every day. They're benefiting handsomely from that budget. And this new Cold War aims to justify that budget and the institutional priorities of the Pentagon, all the Beltway bandits, Booz Allen Hamilton, Raytheon, BAE Systems, they're all there. They all depend on this. Additionally, Raytheon is getting a windfall profit from a Biden presidency that pledges to deliver offensive weapons to the Ukrainian military, which you mentioned. you mentioned, the early anti-Bolshevik network of Ukrainian Banderite exiles, many of whom were Nazi collaborators during World War II, like Yaroslav Stetsko. They sort of set the stage for this ultranationalist lobby that's been pushing for these weapons along with the defense lobby. And so right now, there's enormous civilian suffering in the Donbass region on the pro-Russian side, where the Ukrainian military is constantly shelling these civilian communities, trying to force people out of their homes so they can move the front lines forward. And the Biden administration is encouraging this. It is deeply, deeply obsessed with this anti-Russian policy. It's pushing it for domestic consumption, and it is sending offensive weapons to the Ukrainian military as a means of encouragement. So it's important for the peace movement to stand up to this policy and to to take a look at the suffering of the people of Donbass. And there's a photographer actually that I found. His name is, I believe it's Dean O'Brien. His Twitter handle is Dino Bino. And he's there on the front lines showing the civilian suffering every day. That's our job, is to show how these policies affect real people. Our slogan or our motto is, to break the media blockade, because just as there are economic sanctions on these countries, there's information sanctions, where people who happen to be inconvenient victims are unable to tell their own story through CNN or BBC or whoever. So that's the job we're trying to do.
Zhun, do you have any comment?
Sure. I agree with what John and Max have mentioned. I think it's important to keep the peace movement in the U.S. going strong. We all know that the U.S. aggressions have caused so much damage, so much harm to the people in the world in the decades past. And they also hurt, I think, to a significant degree, the U.S. people as well. I think the peace movement needs to take back the control of foreign policy. And I think in history, when the U.S. back away from its foreign aggressions, we saw genuine progress in human development in many other parts of the world. With the U.S. intervention, even the local problems, let's say the issues in Xinjiang, the issues in many other places in the world, they get further complicated because the U.S. ruling class is never interested in help you solve the issues. They're trying to conquer. They're trying to do something for their own profits. So without the interference of the U.S. Ruling class, I think we would have more space to provide a genuine solution to many problems that we're facing right now. That's my comment.
And certainly to comment on that, I completely agree. Just the amount of the vast amount of wealth that we dump on the Pentagon every year is felt in the neglected human needs of people right here in the United States, and people all over the world suffer as a result. I have to get in a plug for the Raytheon campaign. You mentioned Raytheon, Max. They have huge political influence, and as you may know, they're headquartered right here in Massachusetts, about 5 miles from where I'm sitting right now. So we at Mass Peace Action, with a coalition of other peace groups, have started the Raytheon anti-war campaign to localize some of these international issues and make people realize that these wars that are so far away, many of the decisions get made by institutions that are based right in our own backyard, like Raytheon. And I just want to let everyone know that we're going to be doing a program on the sad 6th anniversary of the war in Yemen coming up this Friday. I just put the link in the chat, and I encourage people to sign up. so that we can mobilize to end that horrible, brutal, and really indefensible war and genocide on the people of Yemen. I know we're nearing the end of our program, so I want to give the two of you just a chance for any last words. We will start with you, Max.
Well, I want to thank you, Brian and Cole, for doing this program. I know there's a lot of opposition out there and a lot of confusion, and I hope that tonight we helped provide a little clarity, at least, to why this program was necessary. And I just want to close by encouraging people in the peace movement, because we scarcely ever hear the word peace anymore in our politics.
It's a shame.
We really, that word is never used by candidates, not on the national stage, not in local elections, and it's a very lonely fight. But I can tell you that, with our work at the Gray Zone, what we've embarked on, it is an uphill struggle, and we've faced a lot of, I wouldn't even call it opposition, it's demonization, dehumanization, official campaigns targeting us to suppress us, censor us, legal campaigns, all sorts of things. When we go abroad and get to meet the victims of empire, the gratitude we receive is so enormous, and it makes it worthwhile. And people in these places that are left out of the headlines often are counting on us. And I think that we need to remind ourselves in this pandemic that there is a greater threat to humanity than the virus itself. And it's the policies that make it hard for people to treat victims. It makes it hard, that puts vaccines in competition with one another, that creates an atmosphere of that shatters medical cooperation, that shatters cooperation on climate change, that shatters cooperation on these existential issues that humanity faces. And it's sanctions and empire. Sanctions is the single worst human rights crime being perpetrated today, primarily by the US government. According to a Venezuelan government analysis, over 1/3 of all people living on the planet are living in one form or another under US sanctions. The most pernicious sanctions target Iran, Syria, and Venezuela, as well as the longstanding sanctions on Cuba. In Syria, doctors are now forced to smuggle medical equipment into the country. The World Food Organization has found food insecurity at record levels. In Iran, we see similar humanitarian crises as a result of sanctions. And in Venezuela right now, because of a policy advanced by war criminal Elliot Abrams, which is being embraced by the Biden administration to prevent the swaps of fuel that allow Venezuela to refine fuel into diesel, public transportation is suffering. Trucks are unable to bring food and medicine to the countryside or even to people in cities. And public transportation between cities has been halted completely in order to ration diesel fuel. It is, I wouldn't call it a genocidal policy, but this is a policy aimed at killing large amounts of civilians, and they're doing it explicitly. And then there's Xinjiang. We have to come back to Xinjiang and understand that this region is being targeted by the United States and its allies, and that the United States and its allies, with the sanctions that they have imposed on Xinjiang for forced labor based on the shoddy, bogus allegations of Adrian Zenz, are causing the unemployment of many Uyghur people because companies are being forced to leave. And I think the goal there is to undo the development progress that we've seen take place in recent years and to produce misery and increase support for a separatist movement and increase opposition, even violent opposition to the government. So sanctions are targeting this area that we are supposed to care for. We are supposed to support those sanctions that are causing people to become unemployed. And that's the perverse hypocrisy of this entire campaign. So I hope that's food for thought for everyone as they open up the newspaper tomorrow and hear more bad news from China.
I appreciate your words, Max, and I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but new sanctions have been levied by the United States and our allies based on the accusations of what's going on in Xinjiang. And China has responded by sanctioning EU officials. And the result of this is it makes diplomacy more difficult when it's never been more important. Zhun, do you have any last words to leave us with?
Sure. I just want to echo what Max has said, that there are people who want to have a war, who wanted to prepare the American public for a war, and we need to be very careful. They control the media, they control the main the sources of information that you all read every day, and they have the support of so-called professional journalists and so many experts, China analysts, etc. And I think that a safer way of dealing with this is that do not first trust a word that they wrote down. Read more, read from a variety of different sources, and form your own opinion based on some good research, and do not follow the mainstream media on this.
Thanks. And I'll just remind everyone that we will be sending a follow-up email with relevant links, including links to where you can find Jun's work and Max's work as well. We know that this is a controversial topic and there's varied opinions on what is going on in Xinjiang province. But I think everyone on this call is in agreement that we cannot let these accusations of human rights abuses be used to ratchet up tensions between the US and China. We cannot allow ourselves to be dragged into a new Cold War between the United States and China. The risk is too great. The consequences could be catastrophic on a worldwide level. And as Max said, the only way we have of even hoping to be able to solve global problems like pandemics and especially climate change is cooperation between the great powers of the world, the US and China. But we are not seeing that from our government. So it's going to rely on activists like the people who are listening to us right now to do things like citizen diplomacy, to speak out, to spread the message of peace. That you're right, you don't hear enough from the mainstream media and from politicians. So with that, I want to thank Max and Zhun for your time and for being so generous with your time tonight. We really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us, and look out for more information coming to your inboxes tomorrow. Have a wonderful night and peace.